I don't think it can be, because architecture is part of life. I mean, architecture is a craft, but it also has become an academic discipline, not to its advantage. I think it's also a kind of post-rationalization of keeping things going. You could say that, you know, somebody who's a very good producer of baked cakes, you know, you could get the same number of calories some other way, but they enjoy baking their cakes the way they do, and it becomes into a kind of art form. But ultimately, it's you know, feeding. And I think architecture is in that same role. It's inevitably, still at the moment, part of the process of survival, although there are many discussions now as to whether it needs to be, whether we need it, whether it exists at all. The discipline of architecture, yeah. The intellectual tradition of architecture and practice. I think I think at best they should be very connected, but I think I blame both the professional organizations and the academies, because in a way they don't want to understand each other's world. I think this is more so in some places than others. I mean, there's an old situation in Europe, which was where the interesting architect of the city would be a professor. And then they brought their students into the office, and some of the students stayed, and then some of the students came back to teach, and it rolled over. I think in a large city that becomes almost impossible. But it leads now to there being a whole world of the academic architecture, of academic architects with their own language. You know, particularly history and theory people have totally their own language, which doesn't have anything to do with what we do when we design buildings. And I'm very conscious of that. I'm very conscious of that when I'm in the States, because I think the States generated that. You know, it developed that there was this whole language and referencing and buzzwords and traditions and famous people and followers and the whole thing. And then there's what you do when you build. And I think because I would criticize that architectural theory in the last 40 years has not been very interested in buildings. Actually, sometimes not at all interested in buildings. In fact, if you mention buildings, guys sort of glaze over. I think the role of academia is to develop architecture, meaning that at certain lucky times, the really interesting projects go on in the studio, but they are projects that have links to likely buildings. I mean that everything has to look like a boring building, but the linkage was very, very close. You could say, here's a project that's being reviewed, and there's something that links it to something that could be done, or has been done, or might be done, or is nearly like, and might push the game forward. And some of the most interesting research is actually going on in a few of the offices, strangely enough. You know, except it tends to get too narrowly focused. But there are weird and wonderful things going on in the sort of Foster's. You know, they don't like the end result necessarily, but the stuff that they have the wherewithal to investigate is mind-boggling. I've been hearing that architecture is in crisis for about 50 years, you know. Just as people said, you know, the advent of television will destroy the theatre, just as they said the advent of the home computer will destroy the office, da-da-da. Yes, they do, but in a way they replenish it. You know, I'm not very good with developers, so I still get part of my income as an academic, you know, and I pay people who work for me, which is a weird thing. You know, we can't afford ourselves.